and welcome to the Ideal Spaces podcast. I'm your host, Flora Lockridge, and today I'm joined by Andreas Hofer, the Artistic Director of the International Building Exhibition 2027, otherwise known as IBA 27. The company is based in Stuttgart in Germany and provides advice, project support, and creates networking opportunities for partners to help find and test new ideas for cities and open spaces of the 21st century. Welcome to the podcast, Andreas.
Thank you, Flora.
Well, I've been really looking forward to speaking to you about your work, particularly because our current research focus at Ideal Spaces is community and space. So there are lots of overlaps. We're similarly very interested in questions about the types of spaces that are being constructed today and also the kinds of communities that these spaces serve. So before we talk in a bit more depth about IBA and what it's trying to achieve, I'd love to find out from you a bit more about your background. I know you're an architect by training, and before you joined IBA 27, you worked as a consultant and project developer for innovative cooperative housing projects like Kraftwerk 1 and Mehr als Wohnen, more than housing in English. Could you tell me about what prompted your move towards the kind of cooperative housing project, and then from there to work for a company that's looking to make some quite significant changes to modern urban development?
It all started when I came to Zurich in the late 80s to study architecture at ETH. There was a terrible housing shortage. There was much speculation. The city always felt like there is no space, there is no opportunity to do new things, and there was a complete shift in economy. So from one year to another, you could say, huge spaces, former industrial areas, turned into brownfields, and there was no idea what to do with them. Some said we need all these spaces for the finance industry. So this was the time when computers came into banking and back offices grew. But naturally, computers got smaller and smaller, and there was not such demand for the space. And so history turned a bit in, couldn't this be the city, the urban spaces of the future for a more mixed use, more integrative, more social, also first ideas of a more sustainable city development. And there is an old cooperative movement in Zurich that in a way was a bit not really active at these times. So they had cheap rents and were kind of closed shops for their members. And we, as young architects, artists, intellectuals, took this old kind of organizational scheme and turned it into new proposals for the development of this brownfields of the industry. And this turned out to be quite successful, pioneering at the beginning, very difficult financially. So we had to reinvent many things. But the projects we did, I'm still proud of them. And the movement grew, and the traditional cooperatives came in and also took some ideas. And I'm quite convinced that this was one part of what we call urban renaissance in the beginning of this century.
Oh, it's so interesting to hear about how it all develops from one idea or starting point and then becomes a kind of wave of change. Are they still there, those initial projects you worked on, those houses and developments?
They are still there, and these cooperatives are on their next projects. So the movement is growing, and the movement is also influencing the commercial housing sector. So Zurich at the moment is really a very nice place to discuss many ideas of what housing can be in the future.
And similarly in Stuttgart, your work with EBA, where Stuttgart is very much a kind of place for discovering, testing ideas, seeing what might work and building a network of people who are similarly minded and looking for opportunities to change ways people are living. For the benefit of our listeners, could you tell me a bit more about Stuttgart and what is its landscape like, urban structures and things like that, just to set the scene?
Yes, we are not talking about only the city of Stuttgart. We are talking about the Stuttgart region, which is kind of a powerhouse in European economy. You all know Porsche, Daimler, Bosch, this kind of traditional industries that are here. It's about 2.8 million people who live here. It's a very networked region. So Stuttgart is in the center, but there are these medium-sized cities around that are not only places for housing, that are also supporters of the huge industry. There is much about engineering. It's a cliche, but they have the image of always trying, testing, finding out new things. And this culture is still present here. The IBA is a celebration of the Weissenhof estate, which is 100 years ago in 1927. There is much architecture and engineering here. Frei-Otto, with his lightweight structures, was professor at the university here. So the culture of invention and of testing materials is very present, but from a housing, from an architectural point of view, I would say the changes we had in Switzerland didn't take place here, which is part of the success of the industry. So you don't have this huge change in industry that also gives you empty spaces to test. For me, it's very interesting to see a neighboring region, you could say. Switzerland is not so far away. But the history is another one, and you have to learn about the specific potentials that we find here. And especially, there is also a huge housing shortage here in the city, and the rents went up and prices go up and land prices are crazy. But they did not yet found strategies to deal with it, I would say. So perhaps we are at the right time, at the right place.
Yeah.
Perhaps we will fail. We don't know yet.
Well, the thing is, it's a problem, not just in that region. I think it's a problem all over the place. House prices going up, cost of living. We've also got various other factors taken into account. Climate crisis, which, is a really significant threat to how we're living and how we will be living in years to come. If we're kind of viewing housing and urban planning through this general wider framework of ecological, social, economic conditions, it's intriguing that there's this overlap with the 1927 Stuttgart Weissenhof estate. There are things that, as you mentioned, are still the same as they probably were in 1927 in terms of like housing shortages, things like that. But it'd be interesting to hear about how things have also changed dramatically over time. What would you consider to be the main changes in conditions or shifts in thought about urban planning since, if we take 1927 as a kind of benchmark?
Yes, we also have to talk about health. So
yes.
in the 20s, the health issue, tuberculosis, there was no means against it. And this is a similarity to the corona crisis we now had here. Quite interesting. And out of these problems, the industry that really threatens people's health also then, the modernist idea was to separate the functions. So housing as a monofunctional issue was kind of an invention of the modernist movement, and the Weissenhof stood for it. Away from the city, a beautiful landscape, just housing, and in the valleys, along the rivers, the huge industrial plants, between infrastructure, roads, railways, and this separation of function that naturally was a reaction reaction to the threat of the industrial city, you could say, turned out to be a problem regarding traffic, regarding also social coherence. So how things turned out to be, I would say, a bit lazy.
Yeah.
The social networks are very difficult to maintain, and you permanently move between these different functions. And this is the big difference to the 20s of the last century, that we think that also by technological means, so industrial processes are getting cleaner, are also getting smaller in scale, that we now have the opportunity to bring all these things together again. This is the main hypothesis of our EBA, that we can recombine everything in dense, intensive social places.
Yeah, I think it's really important to be thinking about that, particularly as population continues to grow. How can we live safely, and how can we do that in a world that's so dramatically changing in many different ways? You've mentioned in previous talks, I know, that urban planning is no longer just about building cities afresh, like on a green meadow, so to speak. But actually, it's a matter of kind of intervening in the urban fabric, the urban cities that we have already in existence. Could you say a bit more about that?
The architectural discussions of the modernist movement influenced building regulation laws, and this was the idea of geniuses, white men, Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, who invent the city, the world, by new buildings. Kind of we are now governing the space and producing nice, beautiful buildings for the society. This doesn't work anymore. Now the space is filled up physically. The heritage, the structures of modernism, the buildings are there. And it's more repair work that has to be done now than an invention. There's so much material that was produced. There is so much energy incorporated in the buildings. We cannot tear them down, and we do not have a second chance, you could say. We have to work with the heritage that is present, that is here, but we have to transform it, and we have to make it viable for the challenges we face, namely decarbonizing the economy, adapting to climate change. There is no more fossil energy we are allowed to use. So it's a huge work that has to be done also on an architectonic and typological level, because all these ideas of modernism are in a way inscribed in the buildings we now have.
And it's so true, isn't it? You don't want to simply knock something down because it doesn't work in its current form, because it's also part of heritage and history. And I know that there are big discussions in the UK, I'm aware of them in particular, where people argue that these historic buildings, they're really difficult to work with because a lot of them are listed. So in terms of interventions, people can't do much to them. So it's an interesting tension, wanting to kind of keep or retain buildings. But then at the same time, there are lots of challenges in doing that. Do you come across the same kind of challenges and problems in your work?
You have to be very precise about this topic. So perhaps many people like this not so dense small housing estates of the 40s and 50s. They are really difficult to keep. Me personally, I'm more fascinated by these huge brutalist monsters, these hospitals, these university buildings of the 60s and 70s that also have much more robust structures. They are made of concrete. They have a very strong skeleton. And we are fascinated by these buildings, and they have much more potential to transform.
Are there any specific examples or projects where you're working with those buildings from the 60s and 70s at the moment that you could talk us through?
As I mentioned, we have a huge hospital complex in Sindelfingen, a city quite close to Stuttgart. They are constructing a new hospital together with a town in the vicinity. So this thing will be empty in 2 or 3 years when they move out. And there we are discussing what we can do with this. Tearing down is not an option. It's 8 hectares in a forest.
Wow.
And 15-story high hospital building, very industrial in the construction, you could say. And we are discussing how to turn this into a neighborhood with mixed uses, with housing, but also places for startups, for social functions, schools. It will be a small town.
That's a fantastic idea. Good to be able to address various problems and also bring together people from different parts of the community and build, I suppose, in a way, build a new community, right? Because it's something that's starting not from scratch, because the history and the foundations are there, but it presents a lot of opportunity and really exciting opportunity to do something different. One of the prominent aims of IBA's work is creating spaces for communities that are places for movement, mobility, and for meeting each other. And I suppose that links on nicely from what we were just discussing with the hospital project. What does that mean in practice? How do you create a place for movement, for mobility, and one where people can meet?
So the mobility issue is a bit the poisoned one here in the area, because so many people work for the automotive industry. So nearly all families are in a way linked to this. And naturally, there are also fears how this will develop, how this will turn. The car is kind of a holy object here. So we have to be a bit careful in discussing mobility issues. And we are a building exhibition, not a mobility exhibition. So there are so many engineers here around that know much more about the construction of cars. So we focus on the spaces where it happens in space. And these are the intermodal nodes. So these are the train stations. These are places where shopping centers flocked around, motorway crossings, often quite difficult spaces, but we see kind of a potential in turning them into more social, more gathering spaces. Maybe you don't enter the Metropolitan Railway, but you just are there. There is childcare, there is possibility to meet other people, and perhaps only 1 or 2 days, you then use the train to go to your office where you meet your colleagues and stuff like this. So we try to invent kind of a second layer of a third space, you could say, that uses these nodes of the infrastructure that we found here.
It's such a great idea and really interesting, actually. I've been to so many train stations and airports where you just think, this does not work. People are using those spaces regularly in everyday life. And I think making them more a kind of destination, I suppose, as well as being a place where they can pass through is a really clever idea. Can I ask about the partners and people involved in these types of projects? Are they coming from all different backgrounds with different experiences and expertise?
So we, as an IBA, we are a team of 20 people, very young, very engaged. About half of these 20 people are really working with the projects. Then naturally we have to do much communication, participation, some administration, but we really work with the projects. We are not investors. So we are not leading the projects, but we are inviting the projects to discuss with us. We started this nearly 5 years ago when we just called for projects here in the region. And everybody was completely astonished, and we are overwhelmed till now. There was so many initiatives, landowners, towns applied to be part of the IBA network. And when we see opportunities to really share ideas, to make international competitions, then we work very closely. Actually, it's 16 projects where we really are kind of the project development and try to bring together universities, industry, new building technologies into these projects.
Yeah, it's an interesting and important conversation, I think, to have. I think it's also about getting young people involved and on board with these ideas. So I suppose going forward, people are kind of incorporating and integrating these ideas of quite innovative uses of space and potential for spaces, rather than thinking, oh, well, let's just start from scratch because we don't know how to change an existing space. I suppose new spaces for new communities indicates certain assumptions, I suppose, about the human condition, who we are, what makes us human, what characteristics people have, how people engage with spaces around them. And so I just wanted to touch on that broader question, really, around what types of architecture should be built for what kinds of human beings. I mean, it seems such a big question. How do you go about finding answers to that through your work?
It's a very interesting question, especially for me as an architect, because the modernist movement searched the ideal person and then the ideal space around this person. And this turned out as an impossible and also kind of threatening idea, I would say. We don't believe that architecture should create specific space for specific people. There is a movement here in southern Germany where people build groups and try to make their projects, and we think a bit critically about that. Houses are much more robust structures than social relations. And houses should stay for a much longer time than our individual needs and ideas. Me here, I sit in a 120-year-old house, and this was done by completely other people than the people who live here now. So we are more thinking about robust, flexible, inviting, diverse structures than of this ideal architecture for the ideal person.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, isn't it? You come across some really wacky extension that someone's built to, I suppose, meet their individual needs and wants, but it's not in keeping with the original fabric of the building, which I suppose is a bit of a tension there. It's individual versus not necessarily collective, but something that will stand the test of time and be for everyone, I suppose, after how many generations.
Yes, but on the other hand, I like these two methods, you could say. A robust structure that makes also the city space, that gives you a feeling of permanence, of a city is always a place with many memories. And then you just go and quite freely you reinterpret, you add, you change, you have also perhaps lightweight, more temporary interventions. But the dialogue between these two kinds of thinking about the city can be very inspiring. So we have also to find testing grounds. Not everything that we make now will be permanent. City is a good balance between continuity, structure, and change.
Yeah, it's a very interesting and important point, I think, because if you don't have any flexibility to test, even if it fails, because I'm sure there have been lots of interventions that haven't gone according to plan, and probably architects or people involved or even the end users of a building sitting there thinking this really does not work, but how can you know until almost you've tried it and done it? Quite an interesting dilemma, but probably an important one.
Often the things you think they will not work, they work best. So in many housing projects, we had this a bit difficult corner where the flat did not really work with the structure, and these were the best at the end.
Yes, very interesting. And do you bring in the end users or the communities who will be living in a particular house or building that you're working on? Do you bring them into the process? So you're discussing the ways they intend to use the building and things like that?
We try to talk with the people really from the beginning.
Yeah.
But huge projects take 7, 8 years till they will be finished. So it's kind of an absurd idea to build a group of people and to make the ideal place for this group of people, and then they move in the spaces they discussed. We try to separate a bit the participation, the discussion from the construction. So we talk about more generic topics. About what kind of possibilities, about what kind of living styles you perhaps perceive in your life, and they are changing. And we try to give options and to talk with the people about density, social infrastructure, meeting spaces, and not so much about their individual dreams of how they actually think that ideal housing should be.
Although it's interesting to know what people individually would like from a space, it's problematic, as you say, if it's a long-term project. I wanted to link back and talk a bit more about education. Do you think there's a change required there in terms of how students who are going into architecture, urban planning, are learning about spaces and ways of constructing spaces and the thought processes behind it?
Architecture is really kind of a lifetime learning process. There is no coherent theory. Nobody knows what's right, what's wrong. So learning has a bit another meaning than in science or in other topics. It's really kind of how a society builds the space it lives in. But if we go to the universities, especially the German universities, they breathe this modernist idea of building cities. So it's very structured from the big urban scale. You go down to the plot, you go down to the house. You have some interior architects, which I think is completely absurd in separating these different scales. And this needs reform. You really have to integrate the scales. You have to discuss about architecture from the interior structure of flats, for instance, but you also have to discuss flats from the exterior structure of urban space, and this is not yet integrated in the education system. So my wish would be to be much more experimental, open. Perhaps you better go to a theater than to the drawing room to learn architecture.
It's interesting you mentioned the theatre, because I studied history of art and I focused quite a lot on German modernist architecture. And there was this one fascinating project in Berlin, I think it was 1926, and it was by an architect called Richard Neutra. And he built a revolving stage in a house. Very interesting, but very unusual project where, every section had a different function. One was kind of like, living space, one was study, and I mean, totally experimental. And from my research, I couldn't find much evidence of it having worked or having not worked. But I assume because it was the only example, it probably was a bit of a failure. But totally inspiring, really, to try it out.
But you find many of these things if you look in art and architecture history. The Oskar Schlemmer which
Yes.
came from Stuttgart with his Triadische Ballett that took place at Bauhaus. Also, the whole Bauhaus idea of bringing together the different disciplines, architects in the young Soviet Union in the 20s, who kind of completely broke up traditional ideas of what space can be. There is so much material in history which is not on the mainstream, but gives us opportunities and ideas to break up again perhaps some rules that really have to be questioned.
Great point, and I think good place to leave our discussion today. It's been really interesting learning all about IBA, the role that your work is playing in kind of sharing knowledge, developing specific strategies, testing ideas about how people can and should perhaps be living or working in the future. And, not just in the Stuttgart region, because we mentioned these ideas are transferable to other cities, spaces, nationally, and also internationally. So thank you very, very much. And I do encourage our listeners to check out the IBA website. I will pop a link in the show notes below so you can see the real range of networks, neighbourhoods, events that IBA are helping to set up across Stuttgart region. So thank you very much, Andreas.
I thank you, Flora, for the talk.